Hi everyone, this is the video for lesson 1.6. Our learning target today is I can recognize the subject in a sentence even when it is a gerund, infinitive, or follows the verb. In other words, sometimes our subjects are going to look a little trickier than what we talked about in the last lesson, like a basic noun or pronoun, and so we want to be able to identify the subject even when it's a little bit trickier. So let's have your notes out and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so our question over in the left column, how can I recognize the subject when it's a gerund, infinitive, or follows the verb? We're going to start by just reminding everybody that we always want to find that verb first, right? So that way, especially with our tricky subjects, having the verb first is going to allow you to narrow that down a little bit more easily and ask who or what is doing the verb to find the subject. All right, so we're going to start with some examples of subjects as gerunds. You can kind of think those ing words when they're as subjects. So those kinds of ing words can be tricky, right? Because sometimes they will be verbs, sometimes they will just be adjectives, sometimes, like the one you're going to see, they will actually be subjects. So for example, if I say, running is Kelly's favorite form of exercise, my verb is, so I'm going to ask, what is Kelly's favorite form of exercise? And the answer, or the subject, is actually going to be running. So again, that might be a little tricky because at first glance, I might think, oh, ing word, that could be a verb or something. But notice in this case, it is actually the subject of the sentence. Similarly, if I say living in Miami can be expensive, I have my verbs there, can be. I'm going to ask what can be expensive, and the answer, living. All right, next we're going to look at examples of subjects as infinitives. So remember, infinitives are when you have a verb in that form to blank, and we've talked about infinitives are never going to actually be functioning as the verb in the sentence. So they are a verb form, but they're never going to be actually doing the verb action or acting as the verb in the sentence. Sometimes, though, you are actually going to see infinitives as subjects. So let's look at some examples. This one says, to speak multiple languages is an advantage in the workforce. So I see my verb is. I'm going to ask, what is an advantage? And the answer is to speak. Okay, so notice my infinitive there is actually not something I want to ignore in this case because it answers that question, what is an advantage? To speak is an advantage. So it's going to actually be my subject. A similar example, to follow his advice may be difficult. So there's my verbs, may and be. I'm going to ask myself, what may be difficult? And the answer, to follow. Okay, so a couple examples there of what subjects as infinitives can look like. Finally, sometimes we're going to have a weird sentence structure where our subjects are actually going to follow the verb. So you may have noticed that a lot of the time when we have a verb and a subject, the subject is going to come in front of the verb, or it'll come first in the sentence. And that is pretty typical, but occasionally when you see a sentence, especially if it starts with something like here or there, the subject is actually going to follow the verb, so it gets flipped. For example, if I say there is a hole in my sock, okay, I can see that my verb is the word is, but there is not my subject, okay, and I know that. So there is what is almost what I want to ask, kind of in that reverse. There is what. The answer is going to be my subject. There is what? There is a hole. Okay, so notice in this case, the subject actually follows the verb, and that's a little bit tricky. Another example might be, here are the shoes for the dance. So I see my verb are. I know my subject isn't the word here. I'm going to ask, here are what? And here are the shoes. So the shoes are actually my subject. Okay, you should see some practice coming on your screen. And finally, make sure you add to your notes, especially if you missed any examples. Let your teacher know what questions you have and determine what kind of practice you'll do.